Julie tightened her grip on the handle of her worn-out suitcase, staring up at the towering penthouse building with a mix of awe and desperation. This was her last chance. If she didn't get this job, she wasn't sure how she'd afford rent next month. The address led her to the top floor, where the elevator doors opened to a sleek, modern living space that screamed wealth glass walls overlooking the city. Furniture so pristine it looked untouched, and an open kitchen that was bigger than her entire apartment. A deep voice interrupted her thoughts. "You're the chef," Julie turned sharply, her breath catching. The man standing before her was devastatingly handsome, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that was slightly tousled as if he had just run a hand through it. His sharp blue eyes studied her with skepticism, and everything about him radiated power and control. "Yes," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Julie Carter, Phillip Lancaster." He didn't offer a handshake, just crossed his arms over his chest. "You don't look like a chef." Julie resisted the urge to roll her eyes. "And you don't look like someone who eats home-cooked meals." For a second, there was silence, then something flickered in his gaze. Amusement, maybe. "I don't," he admitted. "But my assistant insists I need one." Julie nodded, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened. "I can cook anything you need." "I just need a job." Phillip studied her for a moment, then turned on his heel. "Fine, you have 1 week to prove yourself." Julie exhaled, relief washing over her. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet," he said over his shoulder. "I'm not easy to impress." Julie quickly learned that Phillip Lancaster was impossible to read. He was always working, always on the phone, always too busy to sit down and actually enjoy the meals she prepared. He would walk into the kitchen, glance at the plated dishes, and mutter something about how it looked fine before disappearing again. It was frustrating. She had worked in restaurants where customers raved about her food, where people begged for her recipes. But Phillip, he barely acknowledged her efforts. One evening, after preparing an elaborate seafood risotto, she found him standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city with a glass of whiskey in his hand. "You know," she said, placing the plate on the counter, "most people actually sit down for dinner." He turned, arching a brow. "I'm not most people," Julie huffed. Clearly. To her surprise, he smirked just a little before setting down his glass and walking over. He picked up a fork, took a bite, and paused. "Not bad," he said finally. Julie crossed her arms. "Wow, try not to be too generous with your compliments." Phillip glanced at her, and for the first time, there was something different in his expression. Like he hadn't expected her to talk back. "You're not afraid of me, are you?" Julie scoffed. Should I be? Most people, she realized, probably tiptoed around him. But she wasn't most people either. Phillip set the fork down and leaned against the counter, watching her. "You're different," Julie swallowed. There was something about the way he said it, something that sent a strange warmth through her. She quickly turned away. "Well, if you actually ate your meals, maybe you'd realize I'm also a damn good chef." Phillip chuckled, a low, rich sound that caught her off guard. "I'll keep that in mind," he murmured. Days passed, and slowly, things started shifting. Phillip still worked late, still acted like the world revolved around his business, but he started showing up in the kitchen more often. He'd linger while she cooked, ask questions about the meals. One night, she found him sitting at the counter as she chopped vegetables. "You always wanted to be a chef?" he asked, surprising her. Julie hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, my mom used to work 2 jobs, so I learned to cook young. It stuck." Phillip was quiet for a moment. "You're good at it." Julie paused, glancing at him. A real compliment. That was new. "Thanks," she said softly. He nodded, then looked down at the documents spread in front of him. "You ever thought about opening your own place?" Julie laughed bitterly. "Sure, but dreams cost money." Phillip didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was unreadable. "Money isn't always the problem." Julie frowned. "What then?" He looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "Fear." Julie felt her pulse quicken. There was something in the way he said it, like he wasn't just talking about her. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed, and just like that, The moment was gone. He stood, already back in business mode. "Dinner was good," he said, walking away. Julie let out a breath, trying to ignore the strange way her heart raced. This job was supposed to be temporary. Just a paycheck. So why did she feel like she was getting pulled into something she wasn't ready for? Julie wasn't sure when the shift happened, but it did. Philip Lancaster, the man who had barely acknowledged her existence at first, was now a presence she couldn't ignore. She noticed it in the small things, the way his eyes followed her as she moved around the kitchen, how his questions about food became more than surface-level curiosity. He started sitting at the counter more often, watching her cook, like he was trying to understand something about her. One evening, as she was plating a dish, he reached across the counter and stole a piece of chicken off the cutting board. Julie batted his hand away, narrowing her eyes. "You have an entire plate in front of you." Philip took a bite anyway, chewing slowly before nodding. "Better fresh." Julie rolled her eyes, but there was a flutter in her stomach at the way he looked at her, like she was more than just an employee in his penthouse. His attention was dangerous. Because the more he lingered, the harder it became to remind herself why she was here. This was a job, not a fantasy. Yet, when she caught him staring at her from across the room, when his voice dropped just enough to make her pulse stutter, it didn't feel like just a job anymore. The problem with getting comfortable was that it made reality hit harder when it finally crashed down. Julie had just finished cleaning up after dinner when she overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. "She's not like the others, Philip." His assistant's voice was crisp, sharp with warning. Julie froze behind the half-open kitchen door. "She's a chef." Philip's voice was controlled, but there was something beneath it, a tension. "She's a woman who works for you, and you know how this always ends." Silence. Julie's stomach tightened. Always. She didn't want to hear more. She stepped back, forcing herself to focus on the sink, the dishes, anything that would make those words stop echoing in her mind. She wasn't stupid. Of course, a man like Philip had a history. He lived in a world where people orbited him for power, money, status, but she wasn't part of that world. She just needed a paycheck, not whatever complicated mess was brewing between them. Still, that night, she lay awake longer than she should have, staring at the ceiling, wondering why it bothered her so much. Philip was different the next day, distant. Julie noticed it immediately when he walked into the kitchen, grabbed a coffee, and didn't say a word. Fine. If he wanted space, she'd give it to him. She focused on cooking, on keeping her hands busy, but the silence stretched between them like something tangible. When the doorbell rang, she barely looked up until she heard the voice that followed. A woman. Julie turned just in time to see a tall, elegant brunette step inside, her heels clicking against the floor. She moved with the kind of confidence that didn't need an introduction. She belonged in this world in a way Julie never would. Philip barely reacted. "Jessica?" Jessica smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's been a while." Her gaze flickered toward Julie, assessing, then dismissing. Julie suddenly felt like an outsider in a conversation she had no business overhearing. "I didn't realize you had company," Jessica said. "She's my chef." Julie hated how quickly he said it, how easily he put her back in her place. She turned sharply, focusing on the stove, trying to pretend she wasn't listening. Jessica leaned against the counter. "We need to talk, in private." Philip hesitated before nodding. "My office." Julie kept her hands busy, but her mind raced. Who was she? Why did it matter? It didn't. It wasn't her business. So why did she feel like she had just been reminded of exactly where she stood? Julie forced herself to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to the woman in Philip's office. The low murmur of their voices bled through the walls, indistinct yet impossible to ignore. She chopped vegetables with more force than necessary, telling herself it didn't matter. But the longer the meeting stretched on, the tighter her chest became. By the time Philip emerged, his expression was unreadable. Jessica walked beside him, her posture poised, her eyes flicking toward Julie briefly before returning to Philip. Whatever conversation had taken place, It left a weight in the air, something unspoken but heavy. Julie braced herself, waiting for Phillip to acknowledge her, to say something. Instead, he walked Jessica to the elevator, speaking too softly for Julie to hear. Then, without another glance in her direction, he disappeared behind the closing doors. The next few days passed in a haze of avoidance. Phillip left early, returned late, and barely spoke when he was home. Julie tried to convince herself it was a relief. Distance made everything easier. But then, one evening, the silence finally snapped. Phillip walked into the kitchen just as she was plating his meal. He looked exhausted, tension lining his jaw. But this time, instead of grabbing his food and leaving, he lingered. Julie didn't acknowledge him at first, determined to keep things professional. But when the silence stretched too long, she finally sighed. "If you're going to hover, you might as well say something." Phillip exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I've been distracted." Julie set down the serving spoon, crossing her arms. "I noticed." His gaze met hers, something unreadable flickering in his expression. "Jessica is my ex-fiancée." Julie's breath caught, but she kept her face neutral. "That's none of my business." Phillip studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Act like you don't care when I know you do." Julie's pulse stuttered. She opened her mouth, ready to deny it, but the words stuck. Phillip took a step closer. "She came back because she thinks we should try again." Julie forced herself to hold his gaze. "And what do you think?" Phillip hesitated, then exhaled. "I don't know." The honesty in his voice twisted something inside her. She should have left it at that. Should have walked away, let him figure out his complicated past on his own. But instead, she said, "If you have to think about it, then maybe you already have your answer." Phillip's expression shifted, something unreadable flashing in his eyes. "I don't want her," he said, his voice lower now. Julie's heart pounded. "Then why are you hesitating?" Phillip's jaw tightened. "Because walking away from something familiar is easy. But choosing something new, something uncertain," his gaze locked onto hers. "That's terrifying." Julie's breath hitched. She knew he wasn't just talking about Jessica anymore. Her fingers curled against the edge of the counter. "You don't strike me as the kind of man who lets fear control him." Phillip let out a low breath, then, before she could process it, he reached for her hand. His fingers brushed hers just barely, just enough to send a jolt through her. It would be so easy to close the distance. To let herself fall into something that had been building between them since the moment she stepped foot in this penthouse. But then, just as quickly as he had reached for her, he pulled away. Phillip exhaled sharply, stepping back. "I need to clear my head." Julie swallowed against the sudden hollowness in her chest. "Yeah," she said, voice steady despite the storm inside her. "You do that." She turned before he could say anything else, before she could let herself feel more than she already did. Before she could admit, even to herself, that she was already in too deep. Julie tried to keep things professional. She cooked, cleaned, and kept her head down. But the air between her and Phillip had changed, charged with something neither of them dared name. He wasn't avoiding her anymore. In fact, it almost felt like he was seeking her out. He lingered in the kitchen after meals, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse race. He asked questions about her dreams, her past, things that had nothing to do with food. One evening, she was rolling out dough for a tart when she felt him behind her, close, too close. Her fingers stilled. His voice, low and deliberate, came from just over her shoulder. "You're different from anyone I've ever met." Julie swallowed, forcing herself to focus on the dough beneath her hands. "That's not necessarily a good thing." His breath hitched. "It is." She turned slightly, their faces inches apart. His eyes searched hers, something raw and unguarded in them. She could have stepped back, could have broken the moment. But she didn't. Phillip reached out, brushing flour from her cheek with a touch so gentle it made her heart lurch. The world outside of that kitchen ceased to exist. It was just them, suspended in something fragile and electric. Then, without another word, he took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. And suddenly, it wasn't just about lingering glances or unspoken tension. It was real. He pulled her closer, his grip firm but careful, as if afraid she'd disappear if he moved too fast. Julie exhaled, her entire body attuned to him. "I don't want to be afraid of this," he murmured against her temple. She closed her eyes, letting herself lean into him for the first time. "Then don't be." And with that, the last of the distance between them vanished. Julie barely had time to process what was happening before Philip's lips brushed hers. It wasn't rushed or demanding, just a quiet, careful press, like he was testing the weight of this moment, the truth of it. She could have pulled away. She should have. But when his hand slid against the small of her back, anchoring her in place, she melted into him instead. The scent of fresh basil and warm pastry wrapped around them, blending with the crisp cologne he always wore. It was intoxicating, the way he kissed her slow at first, then deeper, like he'd been holding back for far too long. Julie's fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, gripping him as if he might disappear. But he didn't. He stayed, pressing closer, his breath warm against her skin. Then, just as suddenly as it began, Philip pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was uneven, like he was waging a silent battle within himself. Julie's heart pounded as she opened her eyes, finding his gaze already on her. There was something in it, something unguarded, raw. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. But then reality settled back in, creeping into the space between them. Philip exhaled sharply and stepped away, running a hand through his hair. Julie immediately felt the loss of his warmth, but she didn't move. She couldn't. He turned, bracing his hands against the counter, his shoulders tense. Everything about him, the way he held himself, the way his jaw tightened, screamed that he was about to say something he didn't want to. Julie steeled herself. "I can't do this," he finally said, his voice low. The words hit harder than she expected. Julie swallowed, keeping her expression neutral even as her chest ached. "Because of Jessica," Philip shook his head. "Because of me." She frowned, waiting. He turned then, looking at her like he was trying to memorize every detail. "You don't belong in my world, Julie." Anger flared beneath the hurt. "That's not for you to decide." Philip exhaled, his expression torn. "I ruin things. I don't mean to, but I do. And I won't do that to you." Julie crossed her arms, forcing herself to stay steady. "So you're pushing me away before you even give this a chance." His silence was answer enough. Frustration bubbled up inside her. "You're afraid," she said, not as an accusation, but as a truth. Philip's jaw clenched, but he didn't deny it. Julie's heart twisted. She had seen glimpses of the man beneath the wealth, the control, the man who carried scars no one else could see. But if he wouldn't let her in, there was nothing she could do. She straightened, forcing her voice to remain even. "If you don't want this, just say it." Philip hesitated, and for a brief second she saw the war in his eyes. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't want to hurt you." It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. Julie nodded, stepping back. "Then I guess there's nothing left to say." She turned before he could see the way her hands trembled. And this time, she didn't stop herself from walking away. Julie didn't pack her bags right away. She should have. It would have been easier to walk out that night, to cut ties before she let herself hope for something that was never going to happen. But she wasn't ready, not yet. So instead, she threw herself into her work, keeping her hands busy and her mind distracted. Philip didn't avoid her, but he didn't seek her out either. He was polite, distant, every interaction carefully controlled. It was infuriating how easily he seemed to shut himself off, how effortlessly he could pretend nothing had happened between them. But Julie wasn't like that. She couldn't turn her emotions on and off like a switch. And every time she saw him, every time she caught him watching her with that unreadable expression, she wondered if he was struggling just as much as she was. The tension in the penthouse was unbearable. And then, one night, it finally broke. Julie had just finished preparing dinner when Philip walked in, his posture rigid, his eyes stormy with something she couldn't quite place. She set the plate down, ready to leave the room when he spoke. "I saw the application." She froze, turning back to him. "What?" Philip exhaled, running a hand through his hair. The restaurant application. You're leaving. Julie braced herself, keeping her voice steady. You said it yourself, I don't belong in your world. A muscle ticked in his jaw. That's not what I meant. Julie crossed her arms. Then what did you mean, Philip? Because from where I'm standing, all you've done is push me away. He took a step closer, his expression tight with something raw and unspoken. I thought I was protecting you. Julie let out a sharp breath. From what? Yourself. Philip hesitated, and for the first time she saw something almost vulnerable in his eyes. Yes, his voice was quiet but firm. I've lost people before, Julie, people I cared about, and every time it was because I let them get too close. Julie's throat tightened. I'm not them. I know, he said, his voice rough. That's what scares me the most. Silence stretched between them, thick with everything they hadn't said. Julie could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them, demanding a decision. She had been ready to walk away, to move on, but now he was standing in front of her, finally letting his walls crack, finally admitting that she mattered. But was it enough? Julie swallowed hard. You don't get to decide what's best for me, Philip. If you don't want this, then say it. Say you don't want me and I'll go. Philip's hands clenched at his sides, his entire body taut with tension, but he didn't say it. Instead, he closed the distance between them in 2 steps, his hands cupping her face with a desperation that made her breath hitch. I can't lose you, he murmured. Julie's heart pounded. Then don't. And just like that, the last of his restraint shattered. Philip kissed her, hard and urgent, as if making up for every second he had spent denying this. Julie melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. There was no hesitation this time, no uncertainty. Just 2 people who had fought against this for too long finally giving in. When they finally broke apart, Philip rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven. I don't want to be afraid anymore, he admitted. Julie smiled softly, brushing her fingers against his cheek. Then don't be, Philip exhaled, something shifting in his expression, something lighter, freer. I want you to stay, he said, his voice steady. Not because I need a chef. Not because it's convenient, but because I want you, I want us. Julie's chest tightened, warmth blooming in every corner of her being. I want that too, she whispered. Philip pulled her into his arms again, holding her like he never wanted to let go. And for the first time since she had stepped into his world, Julie knew she never had to.